What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. We're on to Chapter 7, The Empires of Persia. Here's our chapter overview. This chapter describes a series of empires that arose in Persia, modern-day Iran, and controlled much of the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and India for over 1,000 years, from about 550 BCE through 650 CE. The first empire, founded by Cyrus the Achaemenid, expanded under him and his successors until it became the largest empire the world had ever seen. The four Persian dynasties of this era, Achaemenid, Seleucid, Parthian, and Sassanid, were noted for several important developments. Number 1, tightly governed administration with networks of educated bureaucrats, tax collectors, and spies to maintain the order and the authority of the emperor. The development of quinat, underground canals, to support the economic foundation of the empire's agriculture. Sophisticated policies promoting long-distance trade such as standardized coinage, road building, a courier service, accessible marketplaces, and banks and investment companies. And finally, the emergence of and elaboration of Zoroastrianism, a popular and influential religion whose teachings demanded a high moral and ethical standards. All right, so first up, we have the Persian empires. They were originally based out of contemporary Iran and spread out from there. There were four major dynasties we're going to be studying: the Achaemenids, the Seleucids, the Parthians, and the Sassanids. These four groups, what I want to talk about a little bit here is on your notes, if you'd like to kind of keep things straight, we have a lot of names, a lot of different specific highlights to each of these empires. I was hoping that you could draw this out, give yourself a pretty big berth on the notes page that you're making, and go ahead and fill in your notes with major people, major ideas, specific items that are connected to each one of these things, and that'll help you to keep everybody kind of connected. But we'll go back real quick. The Achaemenids ruled from 558 to 330 BCE. The Seleucids ruled from 323 to 83 BCE. The Parthians ruled from 247 BCE to 224 CE, and the Sassanids ruled from 224 to 651 CE. Some of these empires do overlap a little bit, so kind of keeping them in line and understanding, I would make sure you read really closely and take really good notes to keep everybody in order. So first up, we have the Achaemenid Empire, 558 to 330 BCE. The migration of Medes and Persians from Central Asia before 1000 BCE. We talked about the migration of the Indo-Europeans that were closely related to the Aryans that will eventually lead themselves to India. But these migration of Indo-Europeans from the European subcontinent to the what we would call today the Middle East and Iran, Iraq area. Back then, for example, Turkey was known as Anatolia. We have modern-day Afghanistan, which was Bactria. We have Persia, which is modern-day Iran. You're looking around those areas. The reason the Achaemenid Empire came into being was it capitalized on weakening Assyrian and Babylonian empires. We go back to the 6th century BCE from earlier chapters, and you'll see that we're talking about the Babylonian Empire. Think back to Hammurabi and his code. He was a Babylonian, and so he is someone that we are kind of looking at the succession to his area of who takes over after him and his empire that he had founded. And the first really big Achaemenid Empire leader was known as Cyrus. He ruled from 558 to 530 BCE. He's the founder of the dynasty. He was known as Cyrus the Shepherd because originally he was a shepherd. He was called by his people Cyrus the Shepherd. His group really did a number of things. Number one, they were really mostly pastoral in nature. Cyrus the Shepherd denotes a pastoral or animal herding lifestyle for their peoples, and they did do small scale, from what we understand, agriculture, but mostly they were focused on herding animals. This led to a number of things, for example, they had worked a lot in the steppe traditions or the steppe traditions that we talked about before. Horseback riding, horsemanship, archery, these are things that happen under the steppe peoples, and using those tactics and being good horsemen helped them to conquer larger areas that would eventually become part of the Achaemenid Empire. By the time he dies, the empire of the Achaemenids reached from India all the way to the borders of Egypt. We then see the peak of the Achaemenid Empire under Darius, who reigns from 521 to 486 BCE. He ruled from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, and he set up his capital at Persepolis. This Persepolis becomes an imperial center, as we had started to talk about with some of the other civilizations that we had in previous chapters. This imperial center is a place where the kings live, the bureaucratic structure lives, where the religious centers were, where festivals were held, marketplaces, trade, laws were made, basically the hallmarks of society that we had talked about before. Under the Achaemenid administration, we had satrapies. These were 23 administrative divisions. If you think about America, for example, you have what's known as a system of federalism. And in the American system, federalism is the idea that the federal government or the national government is in charge of certain ideas or laws or certain actions, while the state governments are in charge of the peoples within their state and can pass laws that oftentimes go along with the will of what the people wanted, but for the national government, but are more specific to the peoples that live in that area. Now, under the satrapy system, it's not a true federalism, but this 23 administrative divisions allows for what we would call today like counties or states in the United States. These administrative systems pledge allegiance to the Achaemenid Empire in Persepolis, and these 23 centers were ruled by satraps who were Persian. And what made this a really unique system was that these satraps who were Persian were like governors over the areas that they were, those 23 administrative divisions, and their staff of under the satraps was mostly made up of local people. So, for example, in the areas of Bactria, there would have been probably a local satrap or governor overseeing that area who would have been Persian, but underneath him would have been a number of Bactrian peoples who would have been administrative assistants, bureaucrats. Now, what this did was allow the administration of the Achaemenid Empire to oversee larger parts of the empire without giving up total power and control to local governors who had allegiances mostly to their local regions, but it did reduce the amounts of ill will or some of the what's the word I'm looking for, negative feelings towards the Persians who oversaw the areas that were under the administrative systems. Now, you might ask, how does one who's far away from Persepolis, say in this giant empire, not start to say, well, I'm getting kind of tired of listening to everything the Persian administration tells me to do. I'd rather just break off and start my own empire. What they would do is two things. Number one, the Persian Achaemenid Empire would send out military officials, military guards to be stationed within those local regions that were loyal only to the Achaemenid Empire, and they would kind of keep an eye. And at one point, they actually were known as the eyes and ears of the king. They would keep an eye out on the governors or satraps, and they would also kind of look for any information about rebellions or any kind of negative feelings towards the empire and be able to respond very quickly before it got too far out of hand. And secondly, there was a number of roving government officials that conducted surprise audits. Now, an audit is when you go in and you check procedure, you check money, you check the books, essentially. You check that everything is being done the right way, and you have a second set of eyes kind of go in and look around. So, for example, if you clean your room and you think it looks good, but then your parents come in and double check your work and kind of say, oh, you missed a spot here, you missed a spot there, and you're going to do a better job before they come in if you know that they're going to maybe audit your room at any time. And so you have to keep it up and kind of do the right thing so that you don't get caught in those audits. This minimized the possibilities of local rebellion because as the Persian Achaemenid Empire just kept coming in and showing up randomly, and you also had the military groups stationed in your local area for any kind of rebellions you might want to start, you probably wouldn't try to rebel as much as maybe you would like. Next, the Achaemenid administration standardized the currency for taxation purposes. It can get confusing if anyone has ever traveled outside of the United States. Dollars are not the international currency in all countries. There are the euro. There's a euro. There are the British pounds. There is different types of monies all over the world that have to be converted, and they don't always represent 1 to 1. Like $1 doesn't represent 1 pound. Sometimes they're off by a certain number of cents. Like, for example, I know the British pound is a lot more valuable, if that's the right way to put it, compared to the US dollar. So $1 US gets you like 1.56 pounds. And so, or excuse me, the other way around. $1 is $1.50, and a pound is only like 1 pound to $1.56. And so by standardizing this currency, you're able to make sure that you're getting what you deserve for the money. Now, this wouldn't have been paper money, but it would have been in terms of gold. And the standardization process would have probably been something like a single coin would have been a certain size and a certain weight, and it had to be made of so much percentage of silver to be considered a coin. And all the administration had to be, and taxes had to be paid in those specific coinage with the same kind of style every time you would receive it. They also set up massive road building. They set up what's known as the Royal Road. This was paved in some sections, and what was nice about it was you could send couriers along it. It allowed for trade to be conducted very easily. You could patrol a road. If you were the army, one of the biggest things along a road is there are lots of areas that might not have been inhabited, but there would have been robbers who maybe stationed themselves along there and would have robbed different people, taking money, taking goods, hurting people. And being able to have one road that was relatively well patrolled, you could cut down on the number of people kind of getting robbed, and you could even have a safer trek along a more stable kind of road. The courier services also allowed for messages to be sent from one end of the empire to the other, and in about 2 weeks' time, the way they would do this is at each stop, they would have a fresh set of horses, some food, and people staffed there militarily. And what would happen is, as you let's say you were a courier and you received a message, you would ride for probably 24 hours to the next postal service, or excuse me, the courier service location. You would then hand the message off to another courier who would get on a new horse who hadn't been ridden yet, and they would be well fed, and they would be able to jump on their horse and ride as hard and as fast as they could, and then drop off the letter at the next station, and so on and so on. And so that way you didn't run your horse ragged. Your person that originally held the letter had some time to rest, and the message could move quickly along the road. The technologies that they developed under the ACommanded system was the Qanat, a system of underground canals. If anybody's ever used a hose outside on a hot day, after about 20 minutes, all the water that ends up on the sidewalk will eventually evaporate. Water has, especially in this area of the globe, the Middle East, a big problem with evaporation. So building these Qanat, or a system of underground canals, allowed for water to travel great distances without being evaporated by the sun. As said before, they did extensive road building. The Persian Royal Road was 1,600 miles. Some of it was paved. This courier service, like I talked about a little before, was a huge innovation. And even today, the United States Postal Service uses a similar kind of motto that the couriers of the ancient ACommanded Empire did, when neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night will keep the courier from his message being delivered. It's something along those lines. You can read it in your book. Now, the decline of the ACommanded Empire came for a couple of reasons. Number one, the policy of toleration under Cyrus and Darius was kind of seen as a high point and a low point at the same time. Under Cyrus and Darius, if you don't subjugate people to a point where they are oppressed unduly, we'll see this again in the Roman Empire, many times you're able to create a lasting empire because the people are able to do the religion that they like. They pay a little bit of taxes, but they also get a lot of things in exchange, like protection from the military. And yeah, it might not be the greatest situation, but hey, what else do you want? Do you want to just live in pure anarchy? So under Darius, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem in 587 BCE starts, and then under his son Xerxes, who rules from 486 to 467 BCE, he harshly represses rebellions in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Xerxes wasn't necessarily a zealot for his way of administration, but he was concerned about rebellions, and his brutal treatment of rebellions made many people find him distasteful because of his such oppressive message and methods that he used to put down rebellions, and this led to increasing public discontent. And then we get to what's known as the Persian Wars. There were rebellious Greeks in Ionia. Ionia is near what we would call Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. There were a bunch of Greeks from like the Athens, Sparta area that we'll study very soon that were in the area living away from their original Greek peninsula. And what they were doing under the Persian Empire, they got a little bit... what's the word? They got rebellious is the best way to put it. They rebelled. They overthrew their areas, and in a very broad showing of patriotism to their homeland, they burned some of their capitals, they overthrew their leaders, and had a rebellion. And then the peninsular Greeks join in, the ones back home in Athens and Sparta area, and they decide, yes, we're going to support our brothers across the ocean, or across the sea in Ionia. Well, the Persians are defeated at Marathon in 490 BCE. What ends up happening is Darius undertakes this campaign to go across to try and fight the Greeks who had supported the Ionian Greeks that are on the peninsula. And when he arrives there, he battles the Athenians in what is known as the Battle of Marathon, famous for a number of reasons. Number one, the Battle of Marathon was where the Athenians, though outnumbered about 3-1, were able to fight off the Persians due to some of their techniques in fighting and some of their technological advancements in terms of weapons. But after the Battle of Marathon, there's a very famous story of one of the messengers who ran all the way back to Athens, the equivalent of a modern-day marathon. And when he arrived, he yelled the word Nike, which means victory, and then he fell dead. And from then on, people started to say, hey, I could run that far in a day and not die, so let me try it out, and that's how we got the modern marathon. This all changed, though, in the Persian Wars when Alexander the Great conquers the Achaemenid Empire in 334 BCE to 331 BCE. Alexander the Great, we'll talk about him a little later, very great general, somebody who conquered probably the most land, continuous amount of land of any person in history, probably for sure the greatest general in terms of having less numbers than his opponents in many battles, yet still seemingly able to use tactics and technologies that helped his forces to overcome those he was battling against. Next, we have the Seleucid Empire. Alexander the Great dies suddenly. He dies after returning from his military campaigns. Many people have commented that without anywhere else to conquer, Alexander pretty much took up to being a lounge-around ruler, somebody who drank. Some historical evidence we have shows that he might have drank himself to death, basically just partying too hard, or he probably died as a result of being poisoned. What we do know is that upon Alexander the Great's death, his 4 generals that followed him around for most of the time while he was conquering decide that they're going to split up his empire. There's a famous story about when he died, that the historian who wrote mostly about Alexander's life and some of the information we have from him, when on his deathbed as Alexander was dying, they asked him, Alexander, you have to tell us who will rule your empire. And he gave a famous phrase that says, to the strongest, meaning that he didn't want to name a successor to his empire, but rather would have wanted them to fight out the rest of their time to figure out who would be the strongest. Many people have commented that this is kind of a bitter end to someone who had such a great legacy as a military conqueror in general. But his generals divide his empire. The best part ends up going to Seleucus, which is the area that we're talking about right now, the Persian area. And Seleucus rules from 305 to 281 BCE. The Seleucid Empire reigns for a very long time. It's attacked by a rebellion in India and eventually gets to an invasion led by the Parthians, who are growing about the same time. And the Seleucid Empire will reign for a little bit while longer until about 83 BCE, when their empire is kind of brought into and crushed by the Romans. That we'll study a little later. Here is the Achaemenid and Seleucid empires, 558 to 330 BCE and 323 to 83 BCE. You can see Achaemenid Empire stretches all the way out to the Hindu Kush on the east, and it goes to the edges of Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, to some of the borders of Egypt. And the Seleucid Empire kind of has a smaller section of the globe. That's the hash kind of looking with the lines on the map. It covers a smaller area, and it still covers in parts of Persepolis, and it still has the Royal Road for most of the way, all the way trying to get to Sardis. Next up, we have the Parthian Empire. The semi-nomadic Parthians drive out Seleucus out of Iran. They built small huts, small structures to help support their nomadic lifestyle of herding, but they also were very good at the horseback riding, archery system of the steppe traditions that we'll study a little later. They had a federated governmental structure. It was similar to that of the Achaemenids with their satraps, but they kind of had some problems with this as they started to have the satraps style of government, but they allowed a lot more decision making and power to go to the local leaders. This led to some rebellions with smaller consequences as a result. They had especially strong cavalry, which were horseback riding infantry. They were weakened by ongoing wars with Romans and eventually fall to an internal rebellion, civil war style conflict going forward. Next up, we have the Sassanid Empire, claimed descent from the Achaemenids, just like the Parthians before them. They believed that they were restoring kind of the Achaemenid Empire in its sense. They had continual conflicts with Rome that slowly weakened them over time. Byzantium in the west, they had Kush in the east. That's how far they stretch. They were eventually overwhelmed by Arab conquest in 651 as part of the ever-growing Islamic empires that were starting to rise up. We'll talk about Muhammad a little later and his revelation that would eventually be known as Islam. The Persian administration and culture is absorbed into local Islamic culture. The Islamic culture that eventually dominated the Sassanid Empire would use a lot of the trade networks, a lot of the city centers, and a lot of the different places within the Sassanid Empire as parts of their empire that were full of science and art and architecture and literature and those sorts of things that many people were looking for as Islam was growing and becoming a cultural force. Here's the Parthian and Sassanid empires, 247 BCE to 651 CE. The Parthian Empire is that brownish mustard color. We have the Sassanid Empire, which has the overlapping area, and it actually kind of overtook under the Sassanids. They overtook the Parthians after their continual battles with some of Rome. You can see that Babylonia is there, Syria, Parthia, Persia, Persepolis is still there. Then we have Bactria and Armenia up in by the Anatolian region. Under the Persian Society, there were early steppe tradition. There were warriors, there were priests, and there were peasants. They had family, clan, and kinship was very important. We're going to see this again when we talk about the steppe traditions a little later with the Mongols, that warriors seen as very important parts of their society, ones who go out and fight, conquer land, defend the people. The priests who oversaw the religions, like, for example, we're going to talk about in a little bit Zoroastrianism, and the peasants who did a lot of the work, and there's a very distinct class for each of those groups. The family clan kinship relationship was very important, that your family and your clan was somewhere you got your name from and your traditions from, and it was one of the organizing structures that became kind of cornerstone, more so than even the imperial process of the Persian society. There's a creation of a bureaucrat class with empire. Now, a bureaucrat is someone who goes around and performs a task for the government with specialization, meaning that, for example, tax collectors, their only job was to go around and collect taxes. They got paid through taxes, and they did this job as a part of supporting the empire as a whole. There were record keepers, people who kept records of all the goods that were being traded, and this would help in the tax collection. Land distribution, land taxes. They were people who, you would think of them almost like lawyers today, but also with like people who kept track of who owned what land or who owed how much money to who, and different goods and those sorts of things. And then there were translators. Any good society, you need translators to translate between your neighbors and making sure that they have the ability to conduct trade, to communicate efficiently, and that way there's less conflict within a society. There was a slave class as well. These were originally prisoners of war of conquered populations, there was debt slavery or debtors. So, for example, you could sell yourself or one of your family members, if you were the father of a group, as slaves to pay off your debts. Children and spouses were also sold into slavery to pay off debt. It was principally domestic servitude, meaning in the home, cleaning, cooking, tending the home, basically anywhere that you would think of, uh, like a maid or a butler today, and also like a cook. Some agricultural labor and some public works were done through the slave class, meaning farming, meaning building of monuments and walls and those sorts of things. But the slave class is a really big part. Not so big as some of the other cultures we're going to study, but it was a big part of the Persian society. The Persian economy, several areas were exceptionally fertile. This area in the Persian region is known as the Fertile Crescent. There is a lot of good soil to grow crops there. Long distance trade benefits from Persian road building. With that Persian road building, there is safety, as I talked about before. There's the ability to trade goods over large distances with carts, with pack animals or animals of beasts of burden, as I talked about in previous chapters. And there were goods from India were especially valued because of their rarity. This is the starting point of Indian spice trade. India is kind of what's known as like a warehouse for a lot of different goods from all over the world. India became kind of a cultural center that a lot of places could bring their goods to and then trade from very far, kind of like a warehouse would be a storage place today. Next up, we have Zoroastrianism, early Aryan influences on Persian religious traditions. The Aryans were the ones that eventually would settle in the Indian subcontinent. What's nice about the Zoroastrianism that we understand is it's a very simple dualistic religion. We have its main proponent known as Zarathustra, who lived from the late 7th to early 6th century. Not a lot is known about him. However, we do know that he came from an aristocratic family, that he became disenchanted with some of the traditional Persian religions, and he decided to wander around for about 10 years seeking guidance and wisdom. Upon his return, he had revealed that he had received a vision telling him about the true nature of the universe, and in his mind, he believed there were two deities that were basically fighting and controlling the whole world. There was the good deity, known as Ahura Mazda, that guy right there, as you can see with the arrow, against a guy named Angra Mainyu. And Angra Mainyu was the deity of evil, darkness, bad things. Anything wrong with the world came from Angra Mainyu. Well, Ahura Mazda was the good deity. Again, Ahura Mazda, the guy right there. Now, Ahura Mazda was in a constant conflict between himself and Angra Mainyu, and Ahura Mazda had 6 lesser deities that were a part of his religion, and they were given this task of kind of fighting it out, but Zarathustra argued that Ahura Mazda would eventually win and that good would triumph over evil, and this is the first religion that we see in this time to arise that has a dualistic nature. There's a good deity and an evil deity. While it might not have been unheard of, for example, in the subcontinent of India with Hinduism and parts of Buddhism and some of the earliest religions from that area, it would have been news to people in what we would call the Middle East today. The priests of Zarathustra were known as Magi or Magi. They were very big on oral tradition of what was known as the Gathas, which was the sacred text of Zoroastrianism. In the Gathas, there's hymns, there's moral teachings, there's songs, there's all these different writings centered around around Ahura Mazda and around the 6 lesser deities that supported Ahura Mazda, and it promises in its scriptures that one day Ahura Mazda will win the battle and that all mankind and all the souls will be judged, and on that day of judgment, those who did good and lived good lives would go to a heavenly realm and probably hang out with Ahura Mazda, whereas those who did evil would be cast down by demons to an eternal punishment and pain. And these oral teachings continued until the Sassanid period composed the Gathas. And so they believed in an oral transmission through telling of stories and careful memorization, but eventually they get written down under the Gathas. Now, different things happened to Zoroastrian followers for different parts of the empires that we've studied. Under Alexander, there was a massacre of the Magi and there were burning of Zoroastrian temples. Alexander did not seem to like a lot of what Zoroaster was proclaiming. There wasn't a strong amount of Parthian support, and so you can assume that during this time there was small-scale violence towards the Magi and the Zoroastrian followers. There was a major revival under the Sassanids and persecution of non-Zoroastrians, so it almost flipped 180 degrees there. And finally, we have discrimination under Islam. As Islam grows in power and expands its empire, any cultural religion that conflicted with Islam as it grew was persecuted heavily into non-existence. And today, there's very few Zoroastrian followers, but it's still kind of centered around that area of Persia where mostly Islam dominates today. Other religious group in the Persian Empire, major Mesopotamian communities of Jews. The Jews were originally based in what we would call Israel, Palestine today, and they had spread out throughout the Mesopotamian area to live in smaller communities. They did compose the Talmud around 500 CE. The Talmud is like the constitution of Judaism is one way to put it, but the Talmud is like how to read what we would call in the Protestant tradition, the Old Testament, but what the Hebrews would call the Bible. If you read the Talmud, it would give you instructions on such and such. Rabbi Ben Gurion one day said, Isaiah said this is how we were supposed to live it out. And Rabbi Boopy, he said this, and this is kind of a conflict between these two people. And a third rabbi named blah, blah, blah said something else. And so you would be able to kind of look and follow your traditions all the way back. So if you're learning the scriptures of Judaism and you'd like to know, this is a weird text, I want to understand how I'm supposed to act this out or live this out, or what does this mean? You could go back through the Talmud and kind of look through and see what did these people who lived long ago, who were wise, what did they say about these things? Buddhism, Christianity, and Manichaeism also survive. We'll talk about that a little later. But Buddhism from the Indian regions, Christianity, which will show up around the year 30, 40 CE, and Manichaeism, which has another duality system in it. They also survived during this time in the Persian Empire. And to this day, there's still small groups living in that area that follow these traditions. So we made it to the end. When you finish studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Explain the rise, expansion, and decline of the early Persian Empire. How did it start? Where did it grow? What did it ended up happening at the end? Compare and contrast the post-Alexandrian empires of Southwest Asia. How did the arrival of Alexander the Great change the empires of Southwest Asia? What did his influence do? How, for example, did one of the empires we study come about as a direct result of some of his actions, specifically him dying? Next, discuss social development in classical Persia. How did society evolve during this time? How was it structured? Outline the economic foundations of classical Persia. How was money set up? How were taxes set up? How was trade set up and used within those empires? And finally, identify important features of Persian salvation religions. How did, for example, Zoroastrianism, that believed in a salvation or an afterlife, kind of set itself up? We'll see this kind of similar style of salvation religions coming up in this area of the world over the next few chapters we're going to be studying. Here's your writing assignment. Write a short response, 5 to 8 sentences to the following questions using specific examples from the textbook and be prepared to discuss them in class. Number 1. What aspects of Zoroastrianism seem like modern religions? How do you think the teachings of Zarathustra would influence the believers' behaviors and attitudes at the time? Number 2. The authors refer to the Persian empires as cosmopolitan. What does this mean? I would Google that. And then, in what ways did rulers promote this cosmopolitanism? How did the rulers support the cosmopolitan nature of the Persian Empire? And finally, the author suggests that classical societies were more complex and more sophisticated than the early societies discussed in Part 1. What evidence do you see of this in the development of the Persian empires? There is a major shift in our textbook from the early societies that are discussed in the first 6 chapters of our book, and then there's kind of this weird shift that kind of clicks in around chapter 7, and we see that there are more complex classical societies that are going to develop. We're going to talk a little bit about Greece, Rome. We're going to talk about more about Mesopotamia and some of the classical Chinese cultures. How do you see this as a shift in the development of the Persian empires? What made them different from the first 6 chapters that we've already studied? As always, it's been great talking to you. It's now time to reread. I hope that this has given you some great context. I hope that those original notes I told you to make those 5 boxes have made your life a lot easier. I'll let you guys go ahead and get to it. Thanks for listening. Bye.
What we do here is go back.